I never imagined that a quiet morning at my lake cabin would turn into a war with the HOA's queen bee, someone so bitter she'd poison the very fish I raised with my own hands. But when Karen crossed that line, she had no idea who she was dealing with. See, I don't just live here, I oversee every environmental regulation in this county. And this time, she was about to learn the hard way that justice swims deep. Let us know where you're watching from today, and if you're new here, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to join our growing community. I woke up that morning with the smell of fresh pine and lake air drifting through my open window. The sunlight glistened across the calm surface of the water, casting golden ripples that made my old fishing dock look like something out of a postcard. I've always said there's no better place to be than right here on my cabin porch, sipping coffee while the world wakes up. It's why I bought this property decades ago, to find peace, not to deal with petty drama. But little did I know, that morning would be the start of something I couldn't ignore. The HOA had been a nuisance for years, but Karen, their self-proclaimed leader, was in a league of her own. She wasn't just bossy, she was vindictive. Ever since I refused to cut down the willow trees along my shoreline trees that have stood here longer than she's been alive, she's been trying to make my life miserable. I kept telling myself I could rise above her nonsense. I'm a grown man, retired from decades of environmental work, and I wasn't about to get into playground squabbles. But Karen never knew when to stop. That morning, as I sat on my porch, I saw her white SUV roll up near the HOA-maintained parking lot just down the road. I could spot her even from a distance, blonde hair tied in a tight bun, oversized sunglasses, and that permanent scowl that made her look like she'd bitten into a lemon. She stood there, arms crossed, glaring at my property like she was surveying enemy territory. I sighed and tried to ignore her, but then I noticed something odd. There were footprints along the dock, fresh ones. I hadn't been down there since last night when I fed the fish. I walked over, coffee in hand, and felt a knot in my gut. Something didn't feel right. The water near the shore had a strange sheen, like oil on pavement after a rain. I leaned down, dipped my hand into the water, and rubbed it between my fingers. A chemical smell hit my nose, sharp and unnatural. My heart sank. I hurried to the edge of the dock and peered into the shallows where I usually saw the glimmer of my fish. I raised these fish myself, stocking the lake years ago with largemouth bass and catfish. I knew their habits like I knew the lines on my own face. But now, all I saw were pale shapes floating belly up, dead fish, dozens of them. My coffee mug slipped from my hand and shattered on the dock. I felt a rush of anger so strong I had to grip the railing to steady myself. Who would do this? There was no doubt in my mind it had to be Karen. She had threatened me just last week, saying, "Maybe you'll take care of that lake if you're forced to." I thought it was just another one of her empty power plays. But this was criminal. I grabbed my phone and started snapping pictures, close-ups of the dead fish, the strange slick on the water, and the footprints leading back up the shore. Years of working in environmental regulation taught me how to recognize contamination when I saw it. This wasn't accidental. This was deliberate. By now, Karen's SUV was gone. Of course it was. She always struck when no one was around, like a snake that slithers back under the rocks when you're not looking. I called the local sheriff's office, but I knew they wouldn't do much without solid proof. Karen was connected friends with half the HOA board and even a few folks on the town council. If I wanted justice, I'd need to handle this differently. Standing there on the dock, I made a promise to myself. This wasn't just about fish. It was about principle. I've spent my entire career protecting lakes, rivers, and wildlife from polluters and greedy developers. I wasn't going to let some petty HOA bully destroy the one place I've worked my whole life to preserve. I walked back to the cabin, grabbed my old leather notebook, and began documenting every detail: time, weather, water temperature, everything. I might be retired, but I still had ties to the EPA. And if Karen wanted to play dirty, she was about to find out just how deep my connections ran. As I sat down, my hands still shaking with fury, I thought of the community around this lake. Families brought their kids here to fish on weekends. Older couples walked the trails at sunset. This wasn't just my sanctuary, it was theirs too. Karen had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. I looked back out at the lake, its surface now marred by the still floating evidence of her spite, and I swore this was war, but it was going to be fought with facts, law, and the full weight of environmental justice. The next morning, the lake looked worse. Overnight, more fish had surfaced, drifting like pale ghosts across the water. The sight hit me like a gut punch. This wasn't just a few fish. It was nearly the entire stock of bass and catfish I'd nurtured over the years. I couldn't shake the image of my grandkids fishing off this dock just last summer, laughing every time they reeled in a catch. That memory clashed with the grim reality now floating before me. I knelt by the water's edge with a heavy heart, wearing gloves as I carefully collected a few samples of both the water and the dead fish. I've worked enough environmental cases to know that testing would reveal the truth. There was no way I'd let this go uninvestigated. Whoever did this wanted to hurt me, but they also harmed the entire ecosystem of the lake. It was more than personal now, it was an attack on the land itself. I called a buddy of mine, Sam Peterson, who still worked in the regional environmental lab. Sam and I go way back. He was one of those guys who could tell you the chemical composition of dirt just by looking at it. When I told him what happened, he didn't hesitate. Bring me the samples. He said, I'll have them tested by the end of the day. Sounds like someone dumped something nasty in there. Driving into town with those samples sealed in bags. I replayed Karen's recent outbursts in my head. She'd been livid ever since I voted against the HOA's new landscaping plan. They wanted to rip out native plants around the lake and replace them with decorative shrubs that need constant fertilizer and pesticides. I knew those chemicals would leach into the water. I stood my ground and told them no, and Karen took it as a personal insult. As I dropped the samples off, Sam gave me a look. If this comes back as chemical poisoning, you know what this means, right? I nodded. It means someone's going to jail, and I have a good idea who. When I got back home, Karen was there, standing at the edge of my property like she owned it. She had her phone out, snapping pictures of my dock and yard. I walked straight over, my boots crunching on the gravel. Can I help you with something? I asked, my voice low but firm. She turned with that smug smile I'd grown to hate. Just documenting all the violations you've got here. You know, for the HOA report. Violations. I barked out a laugh. Karen, you've got some nerve coming here after what you did. Her sunglasses hid her eyes, but I could tell my words struck a nerve. I have no idea what you're talking about, she said, a little too fast. Dead fish, I said, pointing to the lake. Dozens of them, and footprints all over my dock. You think I wouldn't notice her lips curled into a smirk? If you can't keep your lake clean, that's not my problem. Maybe the HOA should step in and manage it properly. Clearly, you're not capable. My fists clenched. I wanted to tell her right then that I knew she was behind it, but I held my tongue. I had to be smart. Accusing her without proof would just give her more ammunition to spin her lies. Instead, I pulled out my phone and started recording. Karen, just so we're clear, I'm documenting this conversation, I said calmly. She stiffened. You can't do that? Oh, I can. And I will. Because whatever game you're playing, it ends now. She muttered something under her breath and stormed back to her SUV, tires spitting gravel as she sped away. I stood there, staring at her taillights, feeling my blood boil. Later that afternoon, Sam called. Got your results. It's confirmed there's a strong presence of a pesticide that's illegal to use near waterways. It's potent enough that even a few ounces could wipe out an entire fish population. Any chance this could have been runoff? I asked. Nope, he said firmly. This was dumped intentionally. No question about it. I thanked him and hung up, my jaw set like stone. I had what I needed to take action. I knew Karen thought she could get away with this because she hid behind HOA rules and her so-called connections, but she had no idea who she was dealing with. I had spent 30 years enforcing environmental laws. I knew every regulation, every loophole, and every way to nail someone who thought they were untouchable. That night, I didn't sleep much. I sat on the porch with a notebook, sketching out my plan. Step 1, compile all the evidence. Step 2, get the EPA involved. Step 3, watch Karen's empire crumble. As the moonlight shimmered on the poison lake, I promised myself I'd make her regret the day she messed with me. She thought this was just about fish, but for me, it was about justice. And justice, when it comes, doesn't knock politely, it kicks the door wide open. The next morning, I was out by the dock early, wearing my old work boots and gloves, ready to gather more evidence. I'd slept less than 4 hours, my mind replaying the scene of those dead fish over and over. Each time I thought about Karen's smug grin, I felt a fire in my chest that wouldn't die down. I was crouched near the waterline, scooping more samples into jars, when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. I didn't even need to turn around to know who it was. That high-pitched honk, like a desperate call for attention, could only belong to her. Karen's white SUV rolled to a stop a few yards from my dock. "Really?" she shouted, stepping out and slamming the door. "You're still out here messing with that lake. Some of us have actual responsibilities." You know, I stood up slowly, wiping my gloves on a rag, and faced her. "Karen, you need to leave my property. Now!" She scoffed, strutting toward me in those ridiculous wedge sandals, like she was about to host some HOA luncheon instead of trespassing. "Your property. That lake belongs to the community. And if you're poisoning it with whatever junk you're pouring in, I have the right to report you." The sheer audacity of her words almost made me laugh. "You're going to accuse me I've spent 30 years protecting lakes from people exactly like you. I know what you did. Karen, I've got the lab results to prove it." For the first time, I saw a flicker of unease in her eyes behind those oversized sunglasses. "Lab results," she repeated, her voice faltering for just a moment. "Yes, pesticide poisoning, illegal near waterways. And guess what? Footprints don't lie," I said, pointing at the dock. "You've been sneaking around here, but you're not as clever as you think." Her face turned red. "You can't prove anything," she snapped. I stepped closer, my voice low and steady. "Oh, I will. And when I do, it's not just going to be the sheriff you'll be dealing with. I'll bring in the EPA. You think a fine from the HOA is scary. Wait until you see a federal investigation knocking at your door." Karen froze for a second, then laughed nervously. "You're bluffing. You're just some cranky old man with too much time on his hands." I pulled out my phone and hit record. "Say that again." I said. "What are you?" "Say it again. Because every word you say from this moment on is evidence. I'm done playing nice." She backed up a step, her confidence cracking like thin ice. "You can't record me without permission." "Actually, I can," I said, my voice sharp. "And I will. This is my property, my dock, and my lake. You've crossed the line. Karen, poisoning wildlife is a federal crime, and you're going to pay for it." For a moment, she was silent. Her lips pressed together so tightly they went white. Then, as if realizing she was losing control of the situation, she did what Karen always does. She got louder. "You're crazy. Everyone on the HOA knows you're impossible to deal with. Maybe you should just sell this place if you can't follow the rules." I clenched my jaw, fighting to keep my cool. "Rules? Is that what you call this killing? My fish isn't a rule. Karen, it's revenge. And I promise you, you'll regret it." With that, I turned my back on her and began photographing the dock, the footprints, and even the tire tracks leading to her SUV. She stood there for another moment, fuming, then stomped back to her car and sped off. Gravel flew from her tires, but I didn't flinch. I'd won that round, and I knew it. After she left, I called Sam again. "Sam, I'm going to need an official report from the lab." "As detailed as you can make it. I want to make sure this sticks." "You're planning to take her down, aren't you?" he asked. "You bet I am," I said. "I'm done letting her run wild around here." That evening, I reached out to a few folks I knew from my EPA days. Old colleagues, people who still owed me a favor or two. When I told them what happened, they didn't hesitate. "Send us everything you've got." One of them said, "We'll get a case started." As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't felt in days, a sense of purpose. Karen thought she could bully me into silence, But she had no idea I was just getting started. Before heading to bed, I stood on the porch, looking out at the lake. The water was still tainted, reflecting the moonlight in an eerie, unnatural way. But I wasn't discouraged. No, this fight had just begun, and I was going to see it through until justice was served. The morning after my confrontation with Karen, I woke up with a renewed determination. I wasn't just a retired environmental officer anymore. I was a man on a mission. The air was cool, crisp, and smelled faintly of pine, but there was no peace in it for me. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, sat on the porch, and stared out at the poison lake. Every ripple on the water seemed to whisper that I couldn't let this go. The first step was to compile every shred of evidence I had. I spent hours photographing the dead fish, documenting the water conditions, and even tracing the footprint patterns I'd found on the dock. I wrote down the dates, times, and everything I'd noticed leading up to the poisoning, the HOA meetings, Karen's threats, and every petty argument she had started. By mid-morning, I called Sam again. Sam, I need those lab results in writing signed and sealed. Can you get that done? I asked. You bet, he replied. I'll overnight it to you. But I have to warn you, this is going to stir up a hornet's nest if Karen's behind it. You ready for that? I smiled grimly. Sam, I've dealt with hornets before. I know how to smoke them out. I hung up and immediately dialed an old contact, Rick Sanders, a regional director I used to work with at the EPA. Rick was one of those men you could trust with your life, the kind who believed in justice above politics. Rick, I said when he picked up, it's me, John. I need your help. We've got a chemical dump in my lake pesticide poisoning. I have lab confirmation and evidence pointing to someone from the HOA. He didn't hesitate. Send me everything. Photos, videos, lab results, statements. I'll have my team review it, and we'll see how fast we can open a case. I spent the rest of the day compiling a digital folder, organized, thorough, and airtight. Years of environmental enforcement had trained me to think like an investigator, and I wasn't about to leave any loose ends. I even gathered old meeting minutes from the HOA, highlighting Karen's comments about taking action against my property. While I worked, I kept an eye on the road. I knew Karen would show up sooner or later, probably with another stunt or some trumped-up HOA notice. Sure enough, around 3 p.m., I heard her SUV pull up again. This time, she brought back up 2 other HOA members, both of them looking uncomfortable as they followed her lead. John, she shouted, waving a piece of paper in the air. You're in violation of HOA policy. We're issuing you a fine for your dock's condition and for improper lake management. I walked out slowly, my phone in hand, recording every second. Karen, you're on my property without permission. That's trespassing, and any false accusations you make will be added to the file I'm building against you. One of the men with her, a tall guy named Bill, who'd always been civil with me, looked nervous. Karen, maybe we should just... No, she snapped. This man thinks he's above the rules. He's poisoning the lake. I stopped dead in my tracks. Say that again, I said, my voice low. You heard me. She sneered. Everyone knows you're dumping chemicals in there. I smiled coldly. Perfect. That's slander, and it's all on video. Thank you. Karen, you just made my case stronger. Bill looked like he wanted to disappear. Maybe we should let the board handle this, he muttered, tugging at Karen's sleeve. Karen shot him a glare, but I could see cracks forming in her confidence. She stormed back to her SUV, muttering something about calling the sheriff. I stood there until they drove away, the camera still rolling. That night, I emailed Rick everything: photos, videos, lab reports, and even the recording of Karen accusing me of poisoning my own lake. He responded within the hour. John, this is solid. We're dispatching a field agent to assess the site. If this checks out, Karen and anyone else involved could face federal charges. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had the upper hand. I wasn't just reacting anymore, I was on the offensive. Karen might have thought she could push me around with HOA threats, but she didn't realize that the EPA answers to no HOA. Before I went to bed, I walked down to the dock. The lake was quiet, the moonlight reflecting off its surface. I whispered to the water, like I used to when I first moved here. Don't worry, we're going to make this right." The next morning, I woke with a single thought on my mind: find the truth. No matter how deep I had to dig, Karen wasn't just a petty HOA bully anymore. She was a criminal hiding behind her position. I knew people like her. I'd seen them all through my career, folks who thought rules applied to everyone but themselves. If she was willing to poison a lake to get back at me, what else was she hiding? After a quick breakfast of black coffee and toast, I started making calls. First up was Bill, the tall guy from yesterday, who had looked like he wanted to melt into the ground when Karen started yelling. Bill had lived in this community longer than Karen, and I knew he wasn't the type to pick fights. I dialed his number, half expecting him not to answer. To my surprise, he picked up. "John, I don't want any trouble," he said before I could even say hello. "Bill, I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want the truth. You saw what Karen did yesterday, accusing me of poisoning my own lake. Do you believe that nonsense?" There was silence for a moment, then a sigh. "No, John, I don't. I know you care about that lake more than anyone. But Karen, she's been running things like a dictatorship since she became HOA president. You're not the first person she's gone after. That got my attention." "What do you mean?" Bill lowered his voice, as if someone might overhear. "Last year, she strong-armed the board into approving a new landscaping contract with her cousin's company, overcharged the HOA by thousands of dollars, and there have been complaints about illegal dumping near the greenbelt chemicals from lawn treatments running off into the soil, but every time someone questions her, she shuts them down." I felt my stomach turn. "So this isn't just about me." "No," Bill said firmly. "But she's got friends on the town council and even a few people in the sheriff's department. Everyone's afraid to cross her. Not me. Not anymore." "Thanks, Bill. You just confirmed what I suspected. Don't worry, I'll handle this. But when the time comes, I might need you to back me up." He hesitated, then said, "If it means putting a stop to her, I will." After the call, I spent hours digging through public records, HOA meeting notes, and county environmental reports. It didn't take long to find patterns landscaping permits that didn't match the work done, funds redirected without approval, and fines mysteriously waived for properties connected to Karen's friends. It was a web of corruption, and the poison lake was just the latest thread. By noon, I had a thick folder of evidence that painted Karen in a very different light. I forwarded everything to Rick at the EPA, along with Bill's statement about the illegal dumping. Rick called me back almost immediately. "John, this is bigger than I thought," he said. "If she's been mishandling chemicals and contracts, we're looking at both environmental and financial crimes. We can bring in federal inspectors, but I need you to keep gathering local testimony." "Don't worry," I told him. "I'm just getting started." That afternoon, I paid a visit to the local diner where a lot of residents like to gather for lunch. I wasn't there for a sandwich, I was there to listen. And sure enough, once I brought up Karen's name, the stories poured out. One older couple told me how Karen fined them for leaving a canoe on their own lawn. Another man said she had threatened to tow his truck for parking near the lake. But the most damning story came from a young mom named Ellen. She ordered pest control sprays along the lakeshore last spring without telling anyone. Ellen said, "I saw the workers dumping something in the water. My kids got sick after swimming the next day." When I brought it up, she brushed me off. I wrote everything down, my notebook filling with names, dates, and angry testimonies. By the time I left the diner, I knew I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for everyone who'd been bullied by Karen and her crooked HOA. That evening, I organized all the evidence into a binder photos of the dead fish, lab reports, testimonies, and financial irregularities. As I looked at the growing pile of proof, I felt that old fire in me again, the same one I'd had when I was younger, standing up to polluters and lawbreakers. Karen had picked the wrong man to cross. Before bed, I stood on my porch, looking at the dark water of the lake. It was still recovering, but I knew the truth would soon surface, just like the poison she thought would sink quietly beneath the ripples. The next morning, I woke with a clear goal. It was time to strike back. The days of Karen controlling the narrative were over. I had everything I needed: evidence, witnesses, and federal backing. Now, it was time to make her feel the weight of her own actions. I started by drafting an official complaint to the County Environmental Board. It wasn't just a casual note. It was a meticulously detailed document that included every piece of evidence I'd gathered: lab reports, witness statements, financial discrepancies, and a timeline of the poisoning incident. I attached photos of the dead fish, the contaminated water, and the footprints leading back to the road. By the time I was done, the document looked like something straight out of a courtroom file. Once the complaint was submitted, I called Rick at the EPA. John, he said the moment he picked up, "My team is on this. We're dispatching inspectors to your lake within the next 48 hours. We'll also notify local authorities that this is a federal investigation. Karen won't be able to wiggle out of this one." "Good," I replied, because she's already doubling down. And she was. That very afternoon, Karen showed up again, this time with a freshly printed HOA citation taped to my gate. The paper accused me of improper water management and demanded I pay a fine. I pulled it down and tore it in half, right there on the spot. I'd had enough of her intimidation tactics. Karen I called out when I spotted her SUV parked across the street. "Come here and take a good look at the man you've been messing with." She got out of her vehicle, her sunglasses on and that smug smirk plastered across her face. "I see you got the notice. You can't just ignore HOA rules. John, you've been a problem since day one." I held up my phone, already recording, "and you've been trespassing, threatening, and now poisoning wildlife. You're done. Karen, the EPA is coming, and when they do, they'll be asking for you first." For the first time, I saw her confidence falter. "The EPA," she asked, her voice rising a pitch. "What does this have to do with them?" "Everything." I said, "You killed federally protected fish species. That's not just an HOA matter, it's a federal crime, and I have the lab results to prove it." Her mouth opened and closed like she was about to argue, but couldn't find the words. She turned on her heel and stormed back to her SUV, but not before I added, "Better start calling your lawyer. Karen, you're going to need one." After she drove off, I called Bill. "Bill, I think the tide is about to turn. Are you ready to stand up to her?" "I am," he said firmly. "Honestly, John, I think most of the HOA is tired of her. She's been using fear to control everyone. But if you've got the EPA involved, that changes everything." By evening, word had spread around the community. A few neighbors came by, knocking on my door, thanking me for standing up to her. One older man, Mr. Thomas, shook my hand with tears in his eyes. "She fined me $300 for planting tomatoes in my front yard," he said bitterly. "But I didn't have the courage to fight her." "I'm glad you do." Hearing their stories only fueled my determination. This wasn't just about my lake anymore. It was about freeing the entire neighborhood from her iron grip. The next day, I took things a step further. I drafted a public notice and pinned it on the community board near the mailboxes. It read, "To all residents, evidence has been submitted to the EPA regarding illegal chemical dumping in our lake. If you have witnessed suspicious activity or been threatened by the HOA president, please come forward. Your voice matters." Within hours, people started leaving handwritten notes under my door, recounting Karen's abuses of power, illegal fines, threats, and favoritism toward her friends. I compiled every note into my growing binder of evidence. That night, I sat on the porch, staring out at the moonlit lake. The water was still tainted, but I felt a sense of hope. I'd turned the tables. Karen was no longer on the offensive. She was scrambling, and I intended to keep her that way. The next step, when the EPA agents arrived, I'd make sure they saw everything. Karen thought she could intimidate me with HOA rules, but now the law was on my side, and the law was about to hit her like a freight train. 2 days later, I stood on my porch as a white government SUV rolled down the gravel road toward my property. The EPA team had arrived, and with them came the shift I'd been waiting for. Karen might have thought she was untouchable, but now the real authorities were here, and they weren't going to play by her HOA's petty rulebook. 3 agents stepped out of the vehicle, all wearing official jackets with the EPA emblem on the sleeve. Leading the team was a sharp-eyed woman named Agent Ramirez. She walked with the kind of authority I recognized instantly, someone who didn't waste time on nonsense. "Mr. Collins," she asked, extending a hand. "That's me," I replied, shaking it firmly. "Thank you for coming. I've got everything ready for you: photos, lab results, witness statements, and even videos." I led them to my cabin table, where I had laid out the evidence binder like a battle plan. Agent Ramirez flipped through it, nodding occasionally, her eyes narrowing when she saw the photos of the dead fish. "This is solid work," she said, "and the lab report confirms pesticide traces. We'll collect our own samples, but I can already tell this isn't accidental." "Do you have any suspects, Karen Whitfield?" I said without hesitation. "President of the HOA. She's been threatening me for months over the lake and other property disputes, and I have witnesses who saw her near the dock the night before this happened." Ramirez glanced at her team. "We'll speak with her. This could lead to criminal charges, illegal chemical dumping, environmental contamination, and possibly tampering with protected wildlife." The agents headed down to the lake to collect their samples, while I stayed behind, my heart pounding. This was it. Karen wasn't just facing me anymore. She was facing the law. Later that afternoon, word spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. An EPA vehicle parked on my property was like a flashing neon sign that something big was going down. By evening, I had neighbors gathering near my fence, whispering among themselves. I decided to address them directly. "Folks," I said, stepping onto my porch, "you all know what's been happening. The lake we share has been poisoned. I have proof that Karen's behind it, and now the EPA is here to investigate. If any of you have stories of her harassment or illegal actions, now's the time to come forward." The crowd erupted. Ellen, the young mom I spoke with earlier, stepped forward holding her toddler. "I saw her workers spraying along the shore last year. I'll testify if I have to." Another man shouted, "She fined me for using the wrong color mulch. I've had enough of her." It was as if years of pent-up frustration burst open. People were angry at Karen, angry at the HOA, and angry that no one had stood up until now. I realized then that Karen had built her little empire on fear, but once people stopped being afraid, her power crumbled like a sandcastle in the tide. The next day, Agent Ramirez asked me to join her at the community center, where they'd arranged a formal meeting with the HOA board. I walked in with my binder under one arm, feeling the eyes of half the neighborhood on me. Karen was already there, sitting at the head of the table, her arms crossed and face tight with forced confidence. "Mr. Collins," she said with a cold smile, "are you enjoying your little stunt, bringing in the feds over some dead fish?" I placed my binder on the table with a thud. "This isn't a stunt, Karen. This is justice. You poisoned this lake and bullied this community for too long. Now you're going to answer for it." Agent Ramirez stepped forward, her tone firm but professional. "Ms. Whitfield, we have evidence linking you to the use of illegal chemicals near the lake. We're conducting a federal investigation, and you are required to cooperate." Karen's smile faltered. "Illegal chemicals? I don't know what you're talking about." Ramirez handed her a printed report. "This is the lab result. The compound found in the water matches a pesticide purchased under your landscaping contract. We've also gathered statements from multiple residents about your actions." The room went silent. Even the other HOA board members shifted uncomfortably, clearly distancing themselves from Karen. Bill, standing near the back, spoke up. "I told you, Karen, you've gone too far." Karen's face turned crimson. "You're all turning against me. After everything I've done to keep this community in shape, keeping it in shape," I shot back. "You mean lining your pockets with HOA funds and terrorizing anyone who disagrees with you? You're done, Karen." As Ramirez continued questioning her, I stepped outside for some fresh air. The crowd of neighbors outside cheered when I walked out. For the first time in years, I felt like the weight of Karen's bullying was finally lifting not just from me, but from everyone she'd tried to control. That night, the local news showed up. Someone must have tipped them off about the investigation. A reporter asked me for a comment, and I didn't hold back. "This isn't just about dead fish," I said, looking straight into the camera. "This is about standing up to bullies, whether they're in an HOA boardroom or anywhere else. We deserve better, and we're not afraid to fight for it." The days that followed were nothing short of explosive. News of the investigation spread across the county like wildfire. Neighbors who had once cowered under Karen's rules were suddenly standing tall, coming forward with stories of harassment, unjust fines, and shady HOA dealings. The EPA agents returned daily, gathering water samples and interviewing residents. Every piece of evidence piled higher against her. 3 days after the community meeting, Karen's SUV was nowhere to be seen. Rumor had it she was holed up in her house, avoiding everyone. But avoiding the federal agents wasn't an option. Agent Ramirez showed up at my door one morning with a look that told me the end game was near. "We have enough," she said. "We're filing official charges for illegal dumping of hazardous chemicals, and we'll be recommending further investigation into HOA mismanagement. Karen won't be running this place for much longer." I nodded, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. Good. It's about time she faces the music. By late afternoon, I got a call from Bill. "John, you're not going to believe this," he said. "The HOA board just voted to remove Karen as president. She's been stripped of all authority. They're also suspending all fines and fees until a full audit is done." I couldn't help but grin. "Bill, that's the best news I've heard in a long time." He chuckled. "Honestly, John, I think you saved this neighborhood. People are finally speaking up because of you. We're going to make sure the next HOA leadership is actually fair." That evening, I walked down to the lake. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the water. The EPA had already started a cleanup plan, using special treatments to neutralize the toxins. Some of the surviving fish were still swimming cautiously near the surface, as if sensing the change. I sat at the end of the dock, breathing in the cool air, feeling the peace I'd almost lost return in small waves. But the real closure came the next day, when a county sheriff's car pulled into Karen's driveway. I didn't intend to watch, but when you see justice rolling up on 4 wheels, it's hard to look away. The deputies went inside and came out with her in handcuffs. She was shouting, her voice carrying across the street, but this time, no one rushed to defend her. In fact, a few neighbors clapped as they drove her away. Later, Agent Ramirez stopped by to update me. "She's facing federal charges," she said. "It could mean heavy fines and even jail time. We're also reviewing the HOA's records. Looks like there's been a lot of mismanagement, and she'll be answering for that too." I nodded, a deep satisfaction settling over me. "Thank you, Agent Ramirez, for everything. This lake, this community, it deserves better than what she's put us through." She smiled. "You did most of the work. John, we just made it official." That night, I hosted an informal gathering by the lake. A few neighbors brought food, others brought fishing poles. We lit a fire pit and watched as the water gently reflected the starlight. It wasn't just a celebration of Karen's downfall, it was a reminder of what this place used to be before her constant bullying. Ellen, the young mom, sat beside me, her little boy running barefoot in the grass. "Thank you for standing up to her," she said softly. "Most of us were too scared to say anything. But you reminded us we don't have to be afraid." I raised my cup of coffee in a small toast. Sometimes all it takes is one person saying, "Enough." In the following weeks, the lake began to recover. New fish were introduced, and the EPA's cleanup efforts were already showing results. I spent mornings on the dock again, the air quiet except for the sound of water lapping against the shore. No SUV, no shouting, no threats, just peace, the way it was meant to be. One morning, Bill joined me on the dock. "Feels like a new chapter," he said, tossing a line into the water. "Yeah," I replied. "And this time, we're going to make sure no one poisons it literally or figuratively ever again." We sat there in comfortable silence, the sun rising slowly behind us. It was a simple moment, but to me, it meant everything. Karen was gone, the HOA was reformed, and the lake, the heart of this community, was alive again. As I looked out at the calm water, I thought about all the battles I'd fought in my life. Some were harder than others, but this one was personal. And winning it wasn't just about justice, it was about protecting something worth fighting for. This story isn't just about a lake or an HOA. It's about standing up when someone tries to bully you into silence. Sometimes doing the right thing means facing the storm head-on, no matter how loud it gets. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear about a time you stood your ground. Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy stories where justice wins in the end, consider subscribing to this channel. Together, we can keep these stories alive and shining.